Join the campaign and vote yes.
Seattle voters will decide on a social housing measure this February that would create a new public development authority to build permanently affordable units.
This is something that's important and should be important to everyone in our community.
But does Seattle need another public developer, with hundreds of millions already spent every year locally on affordable housing?
What's being proposed is sort of redundant.
And how will a measure designed to help not just low-income residents, but people making above the area median income affect our affordable housing crisis?
We need to add more options.
We hear from both sides.
This will actually create more homelessness.
A riveting discussion about Initiative 135 for social housing. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Seattle voters will soon decide the fate of Initiative 135, which would establish a new public development authority to build what's called social housing. Supporters say this type of housing, which is publicly owned and permanently affordable, could help people of many socioeconomic levels, even those making up to 120% of the area median income. But opponents have raised questions about how this measure would be funded, and they say people of low income or no income should be the top priority in trying to solve our housing crisis. This week, it's time to get social with the concept of social housing as we look into a special election on I-135 this February.
You probably already know that housing prices and rents have blown through the roof.
It's not a new problem that supporters of I-135 are talking about, but they do say a yes vote from Seattle City voters could provide some new answers.
I like to say that everybody benefits from this initiative.
Shalimar Gonzales is CEO of Solid Ground, a nonprofit that provides support, services, and shelter, and runs about 180 units of permanent supportive housing in Sandpoint for those in need.
But how do we get from here to there?
Initiative 135 would create a new public development authority, or PDA, that would develop, own, and maintain social housing. That's publicly owned and managed housing that Gonzales says provides a stable future in a volatile real estate market.
With this initiative, this is about keeping it affordable for the life of those units, and that's important.
Unlike federally funded programs geared only for people of lower incomes, social housing would be available to people from 0 to 120% of the area median income, with rents of those earning more subsidizing those who make less. A mixed income community that Gonzales says allows for growth and financial flexibility.
So we have to be able to create this pathway that's sustainable for us. So if you're 10%, 20%, 30%, 40, 100, 120%, you can continue to live in that same community if that is your choice.
If I-135 passes, the city of Seattle would be required to provide 18 months of in-kind support to establish the PDA. And whenever the city considers a sale or gift of public lands, it would have to consider if the PDA should get that property first.
Think it can happen here?
This idea might be new to Seattle, but Gonzales says social housing is already happening around the globe.
We need more housing, we need more opportunities for folks, and this is one way that we can do it, and it's been a proven model, worldwide and within the United States that this actually does work.
But there's a big problem, says Roger Valdez.
What's being proposed is sort of redundant.
Valdez runs the group Seattle for Growth, which advocates for market solutions to our local housing problems, not what he sees in I-135 as more bureaucracy in a region that spends hundreds of millions each year on subsidized housing already.
Right now, I think we've got to go back and look at where did all the money go?
There's no formal opposition to I-135, though the King County Housing Development Consortium published a letter last April with what Valdez says is a real concern. Social housing could take away funding from existing affordability programs that are working and could distract attention away from people who need help the most.
You got to focus on the people that have no income, zero income, or very small fixed income, disabled people. People who are never going to earn enough to pay rent in the market.
And Valdez wonders, if it passes, when I-135 would even have an impact, up against a problem with housing that doesn't have any quick answers.
You need a lot of land, it costs a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time to get through the permitting structure. There's already a market that produces a lot of housing. Let's pull back, let that do its job, and then subsidize what it can't solve.
Can Seattle work out of a housing crisis with the tools it has, or does it need another solution? It's time to nail down your choice on a social housing initiative that's building towards an important vote, February 14th.
Social housing, this initiative really is about helping everyone.
I think the problem is we need more accountability.
And joining us to break down Initiative 135, we have with us Tiffani McCoy. She is co-chair of the coalition behind this measure, House Our Neighbors, and also advocacy director at Seattle's street newspaper, Real Change. Tiffani, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
We also have with us John Fox, who is director of the Seattle Displacement Coalition, the group that wrote the opposition statement you'll see in the King County Voters Guide. John, good to see you too.
Yes, thanks.
And here we go. Yeah, we had a coin flip before the show. Tiffani, I'd like for you to start us off. Why do you support this measure?
So while we're making really important investments in affordable housing here in the city of Seattle, we need to be honest with ourselves and the public that we are never going to be able to dig ourselves out of our scale of need with current financing models that overwhelmingly depend on the federal government. There is another model of affordable housing called social housing that works all around the world that we want to implement here at home so that we have another tool to address the affordability crisis and to prevent displacement and folks entering homelessness.
Great. John, your thoughts here, the big picture on why you oppose 135.
Yes, I, by the way, co-wrote the position statement in the voters' material with David Bloom and Alice Wolt. We are all longtime housing and homeless advocates. The Displacement Coalition is 43 years old with a focus on low-income housing and the homeless. That's why we were surprised when we read the text of this initiative. It is contrary to the term social housing. There's really nothing particularly new about this. It's a proposal to create an entity that will build mixed income housing, including housing all the way up to 120% of median. Right now, there's a housing crisis at the bottom of the income scale. We need to focus on serving the homeless with housing development that largely serves those populations and very low income, with little or no income, not people with incomes all the way up to 120%. We should be shifting our emphasis away from mixed income to more effectively serving and allocating our resources, serving those at the bottom.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to definitely pull apart that issue later in the show. But Tiffani, I want to go back to you and talk about how this measure would be paid for. I know you've heard a few concerns about this. I want to start by asking how much this will cost the city of Seattle, because if this passes, the city would be required to pay for startup fees, basically, to establish the PDA, the Public Development Authority, including office space, staffing, hiring a CEO, legal services for at least 18 months. What's that cost estimate for the city? Can we start there?
Yeah, it sounds like the central staff of City Council ran numbers, and it looks like $750,000 for those operations resources.
Okay.
I do want to just say, like, more globally, we went into this initiative intending to couple it with a progressive revenue source, but then learned that under Washington state law, public developers are not able to tax. They don't have that authority. That would have made the initiative illegal and potentially thrown out. So we wanted to make sure on day one that there were some resources for the developers, so that's why we wrote in that in-kind support. Representative Frank Chop is actually going to be sponsoring a budget proviso in session this year to cover those costs for the first year while we continue working on identifying other revenue sources. But just to be clear, from day one, just like other public developers, the Seattle Social Housing Developer has the ability to apply for grants at all level of governments and even foundations that want to invest in this model.
Got it. John, just some reaction to this, what Tiffani's saying about this investment from the city into this measure. Looks like roughly $750,000. I know you had some concerns about this. Please.
We do. There are right now, quite literally, over 24 existing nonprofit agencies, housing authorities, as well as 3 public development authorities doing housing in Seattle. That's what Initiative 135 would create, i.e. a public development authority they're all competing for the same limited source of revenue. Why give special allocations of funds to another group who's literally going to duplicate what dozens of groups are already doing and have done for over decades, instead of focusing, reaching down, and building housing for low income and the homeless? Okay. That's 40% of the city's resources right now go to higher income groups. They would have been better served, the sponsors of this, to require the city to dedicate more of its resources downward, not to a mixed income model that also serves people all the way up to 120% of median, which in this town is $130,000 per year or more.
Got it. I feel like we need to engage this issue. Tiffani, let's talk about this whole idea of AMI, area median income, and the housing that you're talking about here would potentially serve people from 0 all the way up to 120. Why is that a good idea? You heard some of the critiques that John had.
First off, it's really important to have that cross-class mixed income component, because this model of housing isn't relying on rental subsidies the way that John outlined all the other affordable housing developers. They are dependent on that, Section 8, Section 9, project-based vouchers, and the low-income housing tax credit, which I also hope we get into. All of these programs, while important, have incredible restrictions, onerosity. You can't serve certain populations like undocumented individuals in them. So the mixed income component is incredibly important to cross-subsidization overall, making sure that buildings are close to revenue neutral. I'll say that we do not actually do mixed income housing the way that other cities and nations do globally. What we currently do in the city of Seattle, we call it mixed income. We say we're doing that. But if you look at the examples of mixed income units, it's actually kind of a separate but equal. They're actually separate buildings for folks that are low income and separate buildings or entrances for those that pay market rate. There's also a disparity between the quality of the housing between those two. We think that everyone deserves access to safe, healthy, affordable buildings and high quality construction of buildings. So that's why that's incredibly important. And then I think it's really important to frame this idea of social housing and that we already do it. I strongly disagree with that notion. Social housing, if we had to boil it down to in one sentence, is publicly owned in perpetuity. We do not do any publicly owned in perpetuity housing in the city of Seattle or the nation. We have restrictions on that. You either have to keep it affordable and in public hands for 30 to 50 years. After that, it can be sold off as if we're not going to need that housing.
John, you had a point you wanted to make.
Response. Go to the King County Housing Consortium website, identify the over 24 nonprofit housing developers, and then take a look at each of their websites and the projects they build. Many of them, most of them, are mixed income in the same building that are offering a range of incomes, just like this new entity would be doing. And many of them, because of the covenants tied to the funding they receive, they remain in perpetuity or 50 or 99 years as very low income. They also do land trusts, co-ops, tenant ownership, a fraction of them do. Again, we would be better served if the sponsors of this initiative had said, required the city to shift more of its resources to those forms of truly social housing. Simply calling mixed income housing social does not make it so.
Thank you. I do want to make sure we go down this path of permanently affordable, because I think that's the big difference here. Tiffani, can you break this down? And I want to engage with this, please.
Yeah, I'd say like social housing, and again, let's look globally, because we don't do it outside of Montgomery County, Maryland in this nation. There are many bills in many states that are being pushed because people know that we need to address our affordability crisis in a different way. So we don't do social housing in the city of Seattle. Social housing in places like Toronto, Britain, Singapore, Uruguay, Vienna, those are owned in the public forever. They're not sold off. I'm curious what the 99-year covenant is. Seattle does have a higher threshold. At 50 years, you have to remain in public hands if you get public money, but the low-income housing tax credit, that's 30 years. And then we're selling off these assets. A lot of these nonprofits and whatnot are getting public land, and then they sell it off because they have to make sure that their balance sheet works at the end of the... That's not their problem, but then that public land is leaving public hands forever. Look at the Mercer Mega Block, for instance.
The Low Income Housing Institute talked to Sharon Lee, one of your supporters, projects they provide, and they are sure to include covenants that require these to remain. Receiving public support, trust fund monies, low-income housing tax credits have long terms, not that long, but a long term. And again, they're common projects. The only thing that's particularly unique about going the route they did that was creating a public development authority that gives it some additional bonding capacity, whereas some of the other nonprofits don't. But you cannot make a project work with just bonds and by raising rents on a large portion of the units to subsidize a fraction which are low income. It's not adequate. And what it means as a funding source, it means they will join this new entity, all the other nonprofits every year for funding to sustain it. It's not just for operation. They're going to need money for every project they do. It's a shame they're not reaching down and pushing to create more units serving those at the bottom rather than units all the way up to 120% of median.
Thank you. Tiffani, can we engage two topics there? I want to talk about this idea of this PDA, if this measure passes, competing with other housing providers here, and also this idea that you need to be focusing on the lowest of the low rather than up to 120%. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I want to focus on the second one first,
Please,
if I may. This idea that we need to get away from mixed income housing actually makes me a bit nervous, because if we look at the history of public housing in this country, we didn't have mixed income. We segregated out Black, brown, and working class and poor communities into buildings that were never going to be bringing in enough revenue to keep up with maintenance and operations. And we're creating ghettos through public housing, and social housing is the antithesis of that. It's also important for us to not segregate income levels into housing and communities. So this is a community that's only serving low income. This is a community that's only serving software engineers. That's not the kind of Seattle that I want to live in. And then I'll say as well that this idea that we're just replicating what's already done, none of these providers are giving housing to those that make between 81 to 120% of the area median income. And these people are also really deeply struggling. I have two examples, one with the Seattle Education Association, who endorses us. They're having issues actually attracting teachers to Seattle because of the rent prices. I just got off the phone with the Residents and Fellow Physicians Union at UW. Their number one issue with their members, these are doctors, is housing. And they have to live 15 to 20 minutes from the hospital in order to be on call. And these are some of the most expensive rental areas. These individuals should have access to affordable housing as well.
Can I talk to you about that competition issue, though?
Yeah.
Would the PDA, if indeed this measure passes, would it be competing with other housing providers in our area for resources?
So we would not be, so first off, I want to say in the initiative, we were very aware of this. We wrote very explicitly in the initiative that money for the developer cannot come from current affordable housing anything. We wrote that in there because we don't want to be, I work at Real Change. I see every budget year how homelessness is pitted against housing, which is pitted against, other community needs. We wanted to make sure not to do that,
Okay.
A, and B, we're coming with a progressive revenue source for this one way or another. We are not going to be going after the low-income housing tax credit, Section 8, or any of these. So I understand why the Housing Development Consortium and other groups are worried about this scarcity, because if you are looking at financing based on what the federal government gives us every year, yeah, that's a very scarce pot of money, but we're not going to be utilizing any of those mechanisms.
Okay. John, a quick response to that, and then I want to move past this topic.
We worked with Black, brown, and Asian community for over a decade at High Point, at Holly Park, at Roxbury Village, and also at Yesler Terrace. These were beautiful neighborhoods and communities that served principally those public housing at or below 30% of median. The Housing Authority used a similar argument that I just heard from Tiffani to legitimize wiping out 2,000 units of very low-income housing to create a mixed-income housing model, arguing that somehow, for some reason, Black and brown communities, if they didn't have rich people interacting with them, that somehow that was not a good approach. One other provision in this, which I find particularly troubling, it allows this entity to acquire existing unsubsidized buildings many of them are all low-income units. And over time, as the low-income tenants move out, they can convert to market or above market rate to fulfill their mixed income model. This will actually create more homelessness and a greater shortage of low-income housing in our community. They would prioritize the use of surplus city land for their mixed income housing model over what the city prefers now, which is low-income housing. These are the wrong, 180-degree wrong approach to addressing the crisis at the bottom for low-income people and the homeless.
I guess we should touch on this one last time so I can give you a response to that, Tiffani, this idea of trying to focus on the lowest of the low here.
Yeah, I mean, we have Black, Brown, Indigenous communities that are endorsing this initiative.
Yeah.
We have El Centro de la Raza, for instance. We have Puget Sound Sage. We have Solid Ground, the Low Income Housing Institute. They all are service providers, and they know that we need another model in order to meet affordability. I remember talking to the leadership team at El Centro de la Raza during our endorsement process, and they just wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to compete with LIHTC and other money for them to endorse it, because it is a scarce resource. They also, in one of their most recent projects, wanted to serve up to 80% AMI because that's what their community needs, but they were not able to do that in order to leverage the low-income housing tax credit. So we're just like missing opportunities to also create a Seattle where working people are able to afford to live here as well. And we should be spending a lot more money on the lowest income, like absolutely agree, but we have another option to add to the table, to add to the mix, like other countries around the world do, and we should not be leaving any option off the table.
Thank you. I want to make sure I ask you another question, though. When we talk about competition here, I know some critics have brought up this is something that could potentially distract people from the housing levy, which the city of Seattle is talking about renewing this year. Can you respond to that this would distract from that in some way, and the work that it does to help these people of lower income?
That's important work, but that alone is not going to meet our needs. That alone is not going to reverse displacement or stop homelessness. That alone is not going to make sure that Black and Brown communities are not displaced from the city. That is not going to make us get us anywhere closer to vendors at Real Change. We're on long wait lists for housing. Get that quicker. Yeah. We need to add more options, because otherwise this population that doesn't qualify for this housing, we're basically as a city telling them, that's too bad. It's up to the private market for you. And that's not good enough for the coalition that I represent.
John.
The supporters of this proposal, they're also calling for dramatic upzones in all of our neighborhoods. Upzones, particularly in lower density areas, those areas are full of existing low-income housing, particularly larger families and people of color. Wholesale upzoning of our city is a blueprint for more displacement and gentrification, and it dovetails directly with the proponents' mixed income strategy, again, to promote market rate, even above market rate solutions at the expense of low-income housing. It is a 180-degree wrong direction that we should be taking.
Tiffani, I'd like for you to respond to that if you'd like, and just talk about the people who do support your campaign here, because there's a campaign that's raised more than $211,000 as of mid-January, about half of that coming from Group Health Foundation, a nonprofit committed to health and racial justice. Can you describe this coalition supporting you and what they're saying potentially about some of these concerns John has about gentrification? Yeah,
so I mean, I went into this couple of the service providers that already endorse. I mean, we also have MLK Labor who's endorsing. We have King County NAACP that endorses. I mean, just go to the houseourneighbors.org/endorsements. We just also received Got Green's endorsement. They're really excited about the fact that this not only pairs tenant interests and tenant leadership, but also the green aspect, which we actually haven't talked about here. The passive house necessity for new development, because we are not meeting our climate goals. As a city, we're nowhere near close. We wanted to couple that with housing, because housing is a climate issue, housing is a homelessness issue, it's a racial issue. So we put all of those things together, but I just really want to question John on where this information is coming out that we're going to charge like more than market rate. That's not how social housing works at all. I'm just curious where that comes from because I haven't seen that in the media. Yeah. And then as for upzones, absolutely we'd support that because if you look at the racial equity analysis of the urban village strategy, it is causing displacement, it is causing homelessness, and the history of redlining is still alive and well in Seattle, and I hope we change that in the current comprehensive plan.
I can let you respond briefly and then we need to wrap up, John.
By the way, we were one of the organizations that vigorously fought redlining in the central area in southeast Seattle.
Okay.
It's just incorrect to suggest that by increasing density, somehow that's going to relieve our housing crisis. Surplus land, making that available for higher income. And by the way, WINBY, labor requirements accompany all housing that is already being done. Green requirements, talk to the nonprofits. Dozens of agencies have been doing this for years, meeting those guidelines. There's nothing new about it. This is simply duplicates what organizations, they've overlooked in looking to Europe completely what the existing nonprofits and existing public development authorities are doing.
Okay, thank you. We need to wrap up. Some final thoughts, if you wouldn't mind, Tiffani. If you can keep it 30 seconds, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would just tell folks to go look at our endorsers, to talk more with us about this being duplicative. We do not have high green energy standards on any of our buildings. We have massive public health issues with black mold, et cetera. We have service providers that endorse this. I basically am saying to the audience, do you think what we're doing is enough on housing and homelessness? I think that the answer may point you towards looking at I-135, and I hope that they vote yes in February.
Thank you. John, last word to you.
It would have been, these folks could have gone out with volunteers and created a nonprofit entity and so then lined up with all the other nonprofits every year to try to secure funding. Instead, they want special privilege by creating this authority under city aegis that gives them better access to surplus land to convert units to higher income. And in the 2/3 of the rental housing stock in Seattle is priced between 80 and 100%. 120% of median is well above what most rental housing is out there. That is high income housing. We as a city shouldn't be focusing on that kind of model. We need to require the city to reach down with more of its resource and to expand our supply with things like housing levies and tapping and holding corporations and businesses accountable to replace housing they tear down and higher development fees. Too bad they didn't do those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you very much for this. A great discussion here, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about the upcoming vote on I-135? One person writes, preservation of affordable housing is a great opportunity for the new social housing developer, much better and faster than ground up. Another group says, we believe that Seattle needs to reimagine itself as an affordable, livable city for people of all incomes in every community. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week is a plan to give state residents a guaranteed monthly income, a path out of poverty, or simply a waste of tax dollars. We're guaranteeing a healthy debate on this topic on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.